Creating a good character controller for a 2D game is one of the most essential parts of the game. Pearl Knight, Super Meat Boy, and Celeste are considered the best in their game because they implement character controllers designed for player immersion, which provide smooth, responsive, and intuitive controls. These features allow players to feel connected to the virtual world and create a sense of agency and control over their in game actions. In today's video, we'll create a simple character controller which will give our players some moves. Okay, so this is the scene that we have. We have a background setup and a player setup. The player has a player controller script attached, which only moves it in the horizontal X direction with a constant speed. We are going to be modifying this script to give it all the functionality we want. So let's go ahead and start editing the script. The first thing we want is for the player to be affected by gravity. So we're going to create a new variable and we're going to call it gravity. I want it to be editable in the Unity editor. So I'm going to attach the serialized field attribute to this variable. Next, I want the player to have a downward velocity. So I'm going to create a variable for that. And now we're going to start applying the gravity. I'm going to create a function named fall. Inside this function, I'm going to update the velocity of the player by the gravity. I'm going to add gravity to the velocity value every frame, and that is what we're going to do in the fall function. The next thing we want to do inside there is update the actual y position of the player, the vertical position of the player. However, we're going to do that, we are just going to update target position, and then we are going to keep on decrementing the downward velocity we have, and we are going to multiply it by time dot delta time so that it becomes frame rate independent. Next, we want to call the fall function in the update function. And now if we run this, the player suddenly falls every time we play the game. And what also happens is the player goes beyond the background we have set up. So we want to avoid that. How are we going to do that? We are going to set some foundations for the player positions. So first we want to get a copy of the sprite renderer component which is attached to the player. I'm going to call it body. Next, what we want is a variable to store the screen bounds so that we can compare them with the player position, and a variable to store the player bounds for the same reason. Next, inside the start function, what I'm going to do is calculate the screen bounds by using camera.main.screen.worldPoint, which is a function which Unity provides us. I'll pass in the parameters for the screen width and screen height using screen.width and screen.height, and I'll get the values in the world point, which is the coordinate system we use. Next, we get the player bounds by using the sprite renderer component, which we just called using bounds.size. Next, inside the move function, I'm going to clamp the y position of the player between screen bounds.y divided by 2 and screen bounds.y minus player bounds.y. So, okay, a small error. Screen bounds.y divided by 2 is supposed to be negative of screen bounds.y. But we still have an issue which we can easily fix if we go into the vcam, set all the damping values to 0, and then inside dead zone dead zone height, we want to set that to 1, and we want unlimited soft zone. So by applying these parameters to the vcam, now we can see that the player stays within the confines or within the bounds of the background image we have, or the screen bounds that we have set up for the player. Okay, so there is still one more issue which I would like to fix with the gravity. As soon as gravity is applied, the player suddenly falls with a large amount of speed. So what I want to do is limit this fall speed. So I'm going to create a new variable, max velocity, and inside the fall function, I'm going to clamp the value of velocity between velocity plus gravity, the value I want to clamp, and I want to clamp it between 0 and max velocity. Now if we go ahead and run the game, the player doesn't suddenly achieve the max speed and fall towards the ground. It limits the speed of the player, and that is the sort of behavior jumping. So we will add a variable for jump force, which is the amount of force we want to apply the player every time we jump. I'm going to create a new function. I'm going to call it jump. So every time we call the jump function, we want the downward velocity of the player to be 0, and we want to update the y position by how much? By the jump force or rather we want to update the target position of the player by the current target position plus the jump force which we have set up for the player. Okay, so that is the easy way to implement a jump function, and now we just want to call it inside the update function. But before we do that, we want to get the touch input of a player. So I'm going to create a private touch variable and I'm going to call it touch. So the way we call the touch is we have input dot get touch and inside the parenthesis 0. The 0 is for the first touch which the Unity editor will detect from the player. Next, we want a simple if condition so that if touch count is greater than 0, meaning that we have at least one touch registered on the device, then if touch.phase is equal to touch phase.began, meaning that we have currently just touched the screen, then we want the player to jump. And how do we want the player to jump? We want to call the jump function. So this is how we implement jump for our purposes. Now we want to set up the jump force value to 7. And now if we run the game, okay, my bad, there is an error, argument bounce exception. Okay, so what we're doing is we are registering the touch by input.getTouch every frame, but get touch will only return a value if the touch count is greater than 0. So what we want to do is move that line inside the if condition that we have set up. So now if we try and run the game, and hopefully it should work. Okay, so what I want to do is the touch isn't registered in the games window. We want to open the simulator setting, and now if you run the game, it is working perfectly. The touch is causing the player to jump. Okay, so that is a very simple touch mechanic for this game. So we want the jump to have variable jump height depending on how long the player holds the touch. So I'm going to create a new variable for jump time, one more for the jump timer, and one more for, let's call it jump, so that we have a boolean value so that the player has jumped or not, and one more for jumping to check if the player is currently in the middle of a jump or not. So instead of calling jump from the update function, I'm just going to declare the jump boolean to true, and I'm going to set up the jump timer to the jump time value, or the amount of the how long the player can jump, and then if the touch dot phase is equal to touch phase dot stationary, meaning that we are holding down the touch, then we will set jumping to true, meaning that we have already jumped, but we are also in the middle of a jump and the player has continued holding the touch. So now we are going to update the jump function a little bit. So we are only going to set the player's value of velocity to 0, and we are only going to update the target position if the jump condition is true, so that the jump value is equal to true. Inside this, if jumping is equal to true and if the jump timer is greater than 0, meaning that the player is in the middle, meaning that the player is in the middle of a jump and he still has time left for the jump. In that case, we will update the target position as we have been doing so far, and we will decrement the jump timer by time.delta time so that it becomes frame rate independent, and also velocity should be equal to 0. Next, if the jump is equal to false, uh, then we don't have to do anything. Also, we have to do one more check. If the touch phase has ended, meaning that the player has lifted his finger from the screen, then we set that condition to false. And now we can see that we have a variable jump height. We can make small jumps with a small touch and huge leaps with a long jump or a long touch or a hold. Next, what we want to implement inside the player function is a dash attack or a dash move. So we are also going to set up a few variables for that. One is going to be the dash speed. Next is going to be the dash time, and one more is going to be the dash cooldown. How long before we can make the next dash attack. A few more private variables is a dash boolean similar to the jump boolean, a dashing boolean similar to the jumping boolean, and one more is the last dash time, so that we can keep track of when was the last dash, and then we can calculate how long, how much more time needs to be passed before the next dash. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to create one more condition in our user input touches, and this is going to be touch phase dot moved, meaning that the user has swiped. So the way I want this to work is I want the user to swipe right, which will initiate the dash move. So if touch dot delta position is greater than 10 pixels, in that case we will implement or rather allow the player to use the dash move. Make sure that the delta position is in the X because we want a horizontal swipe and not a vertical swipe. And here I'm just fixing a small error. The last dash time should have been a float. Okay, so if the current time is greater than the last dash time plus the dash cooldown, meaning enough time has passed for the dash cooldown to be reset, then we want to set the dash boolean to true. We only want to update the player's jump and fall. We only want the player to fall when he is not dashing. So we just have that check. If the player is not in the middle of a dash, only then we want to call the jump and fall functions. Next, I'm going to call a new create a new function, update dash. Here, I'm just going to set the dash boolean to true, to false, meaning that the dash has started, but we are actually in the middle of a dash. Next, I'm going to update the last dash time to the current time using time.time, and I'm going to set the dash left to the dash cooldown because that is how long we are allowed to dash. The actual dash function, which will handle all the logic for dashing. First, we check if we are in the middle of a dash. If we are in the middle of a dash, then what we want to do is check if we have enough time left for the dash. So we check if dash left is greater than 0. Now, when we are dashing, we want to update the speed. But if we update the speed variable, then we have no way to get back the actual speed of the player. So we are going to create a new variable, current speed, and that is the variable we are going to be updating from now on. So I'm going to change the value from speed to current speed, and I'm going to set it equal to dash speed, and I'm going to decrement dash left by time dot delta time every frame. If dash time is not greater than 0, meaning we have no more dash time left, then we set the current speed back to the actual speed value and we set the dashing variable to false. Next, I'm going to update all the speed variables wherever I have called them and update them to current speed. At the start function, I want to set the current speed variable to just speed. All we have to do now is call the update dash function inside the update function. So if dash is true, we call the update dash function, and which handles all the logic for when a dash is to be implemented, and we just call the dash function above the move function. A small error, dash left should be dash time, not dash cooldown. So now if we go back to Unity, we can see that the player has a sudden burst of speed and he dashes. In the next few videos, we are going to take a look at player animation and how we can make these look more appealing and immersive. Okay, one last thing which I want to implement is we have a constant value for how long a swipe should be. I'm just going to create a new variable for that, swipe dead zone, and instead of touch.delta position.x greater than 10, it should be greater than or equal to swipe dead zone, and the value for the swipe dead zone should remain at 10. And yeah, last thing we need to take care of, inside the start function, we will start off with dash left equal to dash time because we want the player to have the ability to dash as soon as the game starts, and last dash time should be minus of mathf.infinity. There was a small bug which didn't allow the player to immediately dash as the game started, but that is the functionality we want. And yeah, that's going to be it for this video, guys. I'll see you in the next one where we can make this player more appealing to the eyes in the next video. Peace.